The October wind howled through the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the promise of an early winter that would arrive weeks earlier than usual this year. Derek Ashford had been tracking elk through the dense wilderness for 3 days now, his experienced eyes following signs that most hunters would miss entirely. Broken twigs at specific angles, disturbed moss on the north side of trees, and the faint musky scent that a mature bull leaves in its wake. At 42 years old, Derek had spent more than half his life in these mountains, first learning from his father, who'd been a logger in these parts, then later guiding wealthy tourists from back east during hunting season and stalking game for his own family's freezer when the crowds disappeared and the mountains returned to their natural silence. His wife Rachel expected him back by Thursday evening at their home in Hamilton, a small town nestled in the Bitterroot Valley where they'd raised their daughter and built a life around Derek's hardware store on Main Street. But Derek had radioed her that morning using his handheld CB to say he'd found a promising trail and would stay one more night in the high country. The bull elk he was tracking was massive, probably 800 pounds or more based on the track size and stride length, and Derek felt the familiar pull of the chase that had defined so much of his adult life. There was something primal about matching wits with an animal that had survived multiple hunting seasons, something that connected him to every hunter who'd walked these mountains before him. By noon on that fateful Wednesday, the trail led him to a narrow ridge overlooking a deep gorge he'd never explored before, despite 3 decades of hunting these mountains. The rock formations here were ancient, twisted into strange shapes by millennia of wind and water erosion, creating a landscape that seemed almost alien compared to the familiar pine forests surrounding it. Derek moved carefully along the edge, his Winchester rifle slung across his back, binoculars in hand, scanning the gorge bottom for any sign of the elk. That's when he saw them. Fresh tracks leading down into the gorge along what looked like a game trail that switchbacked along the eastern wall. The tracks were so fresh that water was still seeping into the deepest impressions, meaning the elk had passed this way within the last hour. Against his better judgment, against the voice in his head that sounded exactly like his father, warning him about taking unnecessary risks, Derek began his descent into the gorge. He moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing his weight, using exposed roots and rock outcroppings for handholds as he worked his way down the steep incline. The game trail was narrower than it had appeared from above, barely wide enough for his boots, and in places it seemed to disappear entirely where rock slides had obliterated the path. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you and share these incredible survival stories with viewers around the world. Derek was about 20 feet down when the rock beneath his right boot crumbled without warning, the limestone fracturing along some invisible fault line. He grabbed desperately for a root that was protruding from the cliff face, felt it tear free from the earth with a sound like ripping fabric, and then he was falling through space. The world became a dizzying blur of grey stone and impossibly blue October sky. His body slammed into a narrow ledge about 15 feet down, the impact knocking every molecule of air from his lungs and cracking at least 2 ribs. Then he continued tumbling, bouncing off rock faces and smaller outcroppings until he finally crashed onto a bed of loose scree at the very bottom of the gorge. Pain exploded through his left leg, white-hot and all-consuming, the kind of pain that makes rational thought nearly impossible. When his vision finally cleared and the ringing in his ears subsided enough to hear the rush of the small stream that trickled through the gorge, Derek found himself lying at the bottom of what he estimated was a 60-foot-deep chasm, its walls nearly vertical on all sides, soaring up toward the sky like the walls of a natural prison. He tried to stand, tried to put weight on his left leg, and immediately collapsed back onto the rocks, crying out as agony shot from his ankle all the way up to his hip. Looking down at his leg through eyes that were starting to blur with shock, Derek could see his hiking boot bent at an unnatural angle, the leather creased in a way that was obviously wrong. Broken, definitely broken. Maybe his fibula, maybe his tibia, maybe both bones shattered in multiple places. Derek's mind raced through his options as he fought to control his breathing and prevent the shock from overwhelming him completely. His radio had shattered in the fall, pieces of black plastic and circuit boards scattered across the rocks in a radius of about 10 feet. His beloved Winchester rifle had landed several yards away, the scope cracked, but the weapon itself possibly still functional if he could reach it. His backpack, thank God, was still strapped to his shoulders, though he could feel that several items inside had been crushed by the repeated impacts against the rock faces during his fall. The immediate situation was dire, but Derek forced himself to think systematically, to assess his resources and limitations the way his father had taught him during their hunting trips decades ago. He had some supplies, he had water from the stream, and he had knowledge. But he also had a broken leg, no way to call for help, and he was trapped at the bottom of a gorge that probably saw human visitors once every 10 years, if that. The statistics on survival in situations like this ran through his mind. Most people who fell into remote canyons or gorges either died from their initial injuries, from exposure within 72 hours, or from dehydration within a week. Very few managed to escape on their own, especially with serious injuries. The first night was absolutely the worst experience of Derek's life, and that included the time he'd contracted pneumonia as a child and nearly died in the hospital. Derek managed to drag himself to a shallow overhang in the gorge wall that offered some protection from the wind that was now howling through the chasm like a living thing. Using 2 relatively straight branches, he found among the deadfall scattered across the gorge floor and paracord from his emergency supplies. He fashioned a crude splint for his leg, biting down on his leather belt as he straightened the ankle as best he could. The pain made him vomit twice, his body rebelling against the trauma, but he got it done because the alternative was letting the bones set incorrectly and possibly losing his ability to walk, even if he did somehow survive this ordeal. His emergency supplies were more limited than he would have liked, having only packed for a short extension of his hunting trip rather than a survival situation. He had 3 energy bars that were slightly crushed from the fall, a portable water filter that seemed to have survived intact, a reliable lighter that his father had given him 20 years ago, a small first aid kit with basic supplies, and a space blanket that was torn in 2 places but still functional. He'd planned to be out for just one more night, not trapped at the bottom of a gorge with a broken ankle and no way to call for help from the outside world. Rachel would report him missing by Friday morning when he didn't return home and didn't call. He was certain of that. She knew his routines, knew that he never stayed out more than 1 day past his planned return without making contact. Search and rescue would start looking, deploying their teams across the vast wilderness, but they'd be searching hundreds of square miles of rugged mountain terrain. Derek had told Rachel he was working the northern ridges near the Idaho border, but this gorge was nearly 3 miles south of where he'd said he'd be hunting. The chances of anyone finding him here were astronomically slim, maybe 1 in 1,000 or worse. He needed to save himself, needed to find a way out of this stone prison, using nothing but his wits and whatever materials the gorge provided. On day 2, as pale sunlight filtered down into the gorge and illuminated the prison that held him, Derek took careful inventory of his situation and resources. The gorge was roughly 40 feet across at the bottom, narrowing to about 15 feet at the top, where the walls nearly met. A thin stream of water, probably fed by snowmelt from higher elevations, trickled down the eastern wall, which solved his immediate hydration problem and meant he wouldn't die of thirst. The walls were primarily limestone, ancient and weathered, pocked with small caves and narrow ledges that had been carved by millions of years of erosion. But the walls were mostly sheer, approaching 90 degrees vertical in most places. His ankle throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Derek knew from his wilderness first aid training, from the course he'd taken years ago when he started guiding hunters, that he needed to stay off the injured leg completely, needed to avoid putting any weight on it that might shift the bones out of alignment or cause further damage. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like the October cold, that staying put meant dying here. The gorge would become his tomb, and months or years from now, some other hunter might stumble across his remains and wonder what had happened. The temperature dropped below freezing that second night, turning the small stream into a ribbon of ice and making Derek's breath visible in the moonlight that barely reached the gorge floor. He huddled under his torn space blanket, feeding small sticks and pieces of bark into a fire he'd built between two rocks, using his father's lighter. The fire was small, barely enough to warm his hands, but it provided psychological comfort as much as physical warmth. Derek thought about Rachel, about the life they'd built together over 20 years of marriage, about their daughter Megan, who was away at college in Bozeman studying wildlife biology, and who would be devastated if he died out here. He thought about his father, who'd taught him to hunt in these same mountains 30 years ago, and who'd always said that survival wasn't about physical strength or even skills. It was about refusing to quit, about maintaining the mental determination to live when everything in your situation screamed that death was inevitable. By day 3, as Derek's body began to adjust to the constant pain and the reality of his situation, he had formed a plan that seemed impossible, but was the only option available. He couldn't climb out with a broken ankle using conventional climbing techniques, that much was obvious. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something that would allow him to ascend despite his injury. The gorge floor was littered with deadfall, branches and small logs that had washed down during spring floods or fallen from the sparse juniper and pine trees that somehow managed to grow on the upper ledges despite the harsh conditions. Most of the wood was weathered and grey, bleached by years of exposure to sun and weather, but some pieces were relatively fresh, dark and solid. Derek began the painstaking process of dragging the straightest pieces toward the eastern wall, where a series of small ledges created what might be a climbable route if he could somehow bridge the gaps between them. The work was excruciating beyond anything he'd experienced before. He could only move by dragging himself along the ground, using his arms and his one good leg, pulling his supplies in the branches behind him like some kind of wounded animal. Every movement sent shocks of pain through his broken leg, pain that made his vision blur and his stomach churn. By the end of day 3, after working from sunrise to sunset, with only brief rest periods, he'd gathered perhaps 15 usable pieces of wood, ranging from 4 to 8 feet long and varying in thickness from 1 to 3 inches in diameter. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough for what he had in mind. But it was a start, the first step in what would become an epic construction project. Day 4 brought rain, cold and relentless, the kind of October rain that seems to soak through every layer of clothing and chill you to the bone. Derek's small fire sputtered and died despite his best efforts to protect it, the rain overwhelming his meager shelter. He spent the day shivering violently under his space blanket, conserving what little energy his body had left, letting the rain fill his water bottles so that at least he wouldn't have to worry about dehydration. His energy bars were gone. The last one consumed that morning, and now he was truly alone with nothing but the rain, the unrelenting pain in his leg, and the growing weakness in his body as it began to cannibalize its own muscle tissue for fuel. Hypothermia was a real and immediate risk now. Derek knew the signs from his training, the shivering, the confusion, the overwhelming desire to just lie down and sleep. He forced himself to move periodically, to flex his muscles and generate heat, even though every movement was agony. He recited facts to himself, testing his mental clarity, making sure his brain wasn't beginning to shut down. He sang songs from his childhood, talked to Rachel as if she were there beside him, made plans for what he'd do when he got out of this gorge. Not if, but when. That distinction was crucial to his survival. On day 5, the rain finally stopped, and Derek woke to pale sunlight filtering down into the gorge, illuminating the wet rocks and creating dozens of small rainbows in the mist. His mouth was dry despite all the water he'd been drinking, and his injured leg had swollen to twice its normal size. The skin stretched tight and discolored with shades of purple and green that indicated serious internal bleeding and tissue damage. Infection was setting in. He could feel it, could see the red streaks beginning to radiate out from the injury site. He had antibiotics in his first aid kit, basic, broad-spectrum pills that he'd packed for minor infections, and he started taking them according to the instructions on the package. But Derek knew that without real medical care, without proper cleaning and treatment, infection in what was almost certainly a compound fracture could kill him as surely as exposure or starvation. The clock was ticking, and every hour that passed decreased his chances of survival. That morning, driven by a renewed sense of urgency and the knowledge that his body was slowly failing, Derek returned to gathering branches with fierce determination. Death was close enough now that he could feel its presence, could sense it waiting in the shadows of the gorge, and that proximity gave him a strange kind of clarity. He would build his ladder, he would climb out of this stone prison, and he would see his wife and daughter again. There was no other option, no alternative plan, no hope of rescue. It was escape or die, and Derek chose escape. He worked through the day despite his body's increasingly desperate protests, pulling branch after branch from the debris field at the gorge bottom, testing each one for soundness, sorting them by size and strength. By day 7, after working essentially non-stop whenever he had daylight to see, Derek had perhaps 40 usable pieces arranged by size near the eastern wall where he planned to build his ladder. Some pieces were solid hardwood, probably oak or hickory that had washed down from higher elevations, while others were softer pine or juniper that had fallen from the trees growing on the ledges above. He began the critical process of testing each piece, putting his weight on them to check for rot or structural weakness, checking for cracks or signs of insect damage that might cause them to fail under load. About a third of his collected pieces failed these tests, cracking or crumbling under pressure, and he discarded them with bitter disappointment. The rest, maybe 25 or 30 solid pieces, he kept and arranged in order of size and strength. Derek's hands were raw and bleeding from handling the rough bark and sharp rocks, his fingernails torn and broken, his palms covered in blisters that had burst and become infected. His broken leg had taken on a grey tinge that absolutely terrified him because he knew what that meant. Tissue death, necrosis, the beginning stages of gangrene that could spread up his leg and kill him within days if left untreated. But he had the beginnings of something now, the raw materials for a structure that might, if he was lucky and skilled and the wood held, carry him back to the world of the living. He had a way forward, a plan, and that gave him hope. Derek spent day 8 studying the eastern wall in minute detail, planning his route with the care of a mountaineer planning an assault on Everest. The first ledge was about 8 feet up from the gorge floor, a narrow shelf of rock maybe 6 inches deep and 2 feet wide. If he could bridge the distance to that ledge, create a stable ladder section that would carry him up those 8 feet, there was another ledge about 6 feet higher up the wall, then another ledge 6 feet above that one, and another, creating a rough staircase pattern up the wall. The wall wasn't completely vertical. It angled slightly, maybe 80 or 85 degrees, which meant that if he could create stable footholds and handholds, he might be able to lean against the rock face for support as he climbed, using the wall itself to help bear his weight. He began the construction process. lashing branches together with paracord from his pack and strips of cloth torn from his shirt, creating crude ladder sections that could be wedged between the floor and the first ledge. The work required a level of precision that was difficult to achieve, with hands that shook from weakness and cold. Each joint had to be tight, each lashing had to be secure, because any failure during the climb would likely be fatal. Derek worked slowly and methodically, double-checking every connection, testing and retesting each section before moving on to the next. The work consumed him utterly, becoming an obsession that drove out all other thoughts. Hours blurred together into an endless cycle of selecting branches, positioning them, lashing them together, testing the structure, making adjustments, and starting again. He forgot what day it was, lost track of time, existed only in the moment of creation. 10 days in the gorge, 11, 12. His body was failing rapidly now, the infection spreading, his strength ebbing away like water through cupped hands. But the ladder was taking shape, becoming real, transforming from desperate hope into physical reality. 3 sections completed, each one a rickety framework of branches bound together with everything he could find, each one representing dozens of hours of painstaking work. On what Derek thought was probably day 12, though he was no longer certain of his count, he attempted his first climb. The moment felt momentous, terrifying, the culmination of days of brutal labor. He positioned the first ladder section carefully against the wall, bracing the bottom against a large boulder to prevent it from kicking out. Using his good leg and the remaining strength in his arms, he pulled himself up onto the crude structure, testing each crosspiece before committing his full weight to it. The ladder creaked and swayed alarmingly, the branches flexing under his weight. But it held. Step by careful step, handhold by handhold, Derek ascended the first section until he reached the first ledge 8 feet above the gorge floor. He pulled himself onto the narrow shelf and lay there gasping, his heart pounding, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. 8 feet up, 52 feet to go. The numbers seemed impossible, overwhelming, but he'd proven that his concept could work. The ladder could support his weight, despite being built from nothing but scavenged wood and improvised bindings. He just needed more sections, more materials, and the strength to complete the climb. But as Derek began the descent back to the gorge floor to continue building, he realized that going down was actually harder than climbing up. His body was so weak now that controlling his movement was nearly impossible. He half fell, half slid back down the ladder, landing in a painful heap at the bottom, further aggravating his broken leg. But he'd proven it could work, proven that escape was possible, and that knowledge gave him the strength to continue. Days 13 and 14 passed in a fever dream, a blur of construction work and delirium as Derek's infection worsened dramatically. He was burning up, his body temperature soaring despite the cold October weather, sweating through his clothes, even as he shivered uncontrollably. The infection had clearly spread beyond his leg, entering his bloodstream, and Derek knew he was now fighting both the gorge and his own failing body. He worked when he could, during the brief periods when the fever subsided enough for him to think clearly, building the second and third ladder sections that would carry him from the first ledge to the second, and from the second to the third. His hands shook constantly now, making the delicate work of lashing branches together nearly impossible. He dropped things repeatedly, watched helplessly as precious paracord fell out of his numb fingers. He talked to himself constantly, sometimes thinking he was talking to Rachel, sometimes to his father who'd been dead for 5 years, sometimes to people he didn't recognize. He wasn't always sure what was memory and what was hallucination, what was real and what was fever-induced fantasy, but somehow during his lucid moments the work continued. The ladder grew, section by section, reaching higher up the wall. By day 15, working in short bursts between periods of unconsciousness, Derek had completed 5 ladder sections. According to his calculations, the route he'd planned would require 6 sections, maybe 7, depending on exactly how the ledges lined up. But he was out of paracord, his pack empty, and his clothes were in such tatters that there was nothing left to tear into binding strips. He stared at his creation with eyes that could barely focus, this impossible ladder built from nothing but debris and desperation, and knew that he was close, but perhaps not close enough. 5/6 of the way to freedom, 83% complete, but that last 17% might as well be a mile. That's when Derek remembered his boots, specifically the laces that held them together. With fingers that barely worked, he unlaced his hiking boots completely, pulling out the long nylon cords that ran through the metal eyelets. Combined with some thin but surprisingly strong roots he'd been collecting from along the stream bank, he had just enough material to complete 1 more ladder section, maybe 2 sections if he could find more roots, and if the roots proved strong enough to serve as bindings. He spent what he thought was day 16 gathering roots from along the stream, digging them out of the cold mud with his bare hands, testing each one by pulling on it with all his remaining strength, selecting only the strongest ones that didn't break under tension. His body was barely functioning by this point. He moved like an ancient man, bent and broken, every action requiring tremendous willpower to overcome his body's desire to simply lie down and stop. His broken leg was beyond pain now, had moved past agony into a kind of distant numbness that was probably more frightening than the pain had been. He could smell it. Smell the sickly sweet odor of tissue death, of gangrene spreading through his leg. If he didn't get medical attention within the next day or 2, they would almost certainly have to amputate, assuming he survived long enough to reach medical attention. Day 17 dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect October morning that Derek had always loved, with frost covering everything and the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Derek knew with absolute certainty that this was his last chance, his final opportunity to escape before his body failed completely. The infection had spread up his leg past his knee, and he could feel the fever consuming him from the inside out, burning through the last of his reserves. He completed the 6th ladder section in the pale morning light, lashing branches together with bootlaces and roots, his fingers clumsy and numb from cold and infection, working more by feel than by sight. The section was rougher than the others, less stable, but it would have to do. There was no more time, no more materials, no more strength for perfection. Then, knowing that this climb would either save his life or end it, Derek began his ascent. He started at the bottom of the first section, the one he'd climbed during his test run days earlier, and began pulling himself upward. The first section went smoothly despite his weakness, his body remembering the movements, muscle memory carrying him to the first ledge, even though conscious thought was becoming increasingly difficult. He rested there on the narrow shelf of stone, breathing hard, his chest heaving, trying to gather strength for the next section. He positioned the second ladder section, wedging it between the first and second ledges, testing it to make sure it was as secure as possible. Then up he went, his arms trembling with effort, the branches creaking ominously under his weight. But they held, the wood proving stronger than it looked. Second ledge achieved. Rest, breathe. Position the third section between the second and third ledges. Test it. Begin climbing again. The wood creaked even more loudly on this section, and Derek felt one of the cross pieces shift under his weight, but it held. Third ledge. Derek was halfway up now, approximately 30 feet above the gorge floor, 30 feet closer to freedom. He didn't look down, kept his eyes fixed on the wall in front of him, focused entirely on the next handhold, the next foothold, the next section of ladder. His vision was tunneling, darkness creeping in from the edges, his body beginning to shut down from the combination of infection, exhaustion, and starvation. He could barely feel his hands anymore, could barely tell if he was actually gripping the branches or if his fingers were just resting against them. But he continued climbing, driven by pure willpower and the animal desire to survive. Up the fourth section. The structure swayed more dramatically now, the accumulated weight and stress on the lower sections causing increased movement in the upper sections. Derek moved slowly, carefully, testing each handhold before trusting it with his weight. Fourth ledge achieved. 3 more sections to go, about 24 feet remaining. He was so close now, so achingly close to freedom. The 5th section nearly killed him, nearly ended his escape attempt in the most brutal way possible. Derek was about halfway up this section, maybe 4 feet above the 4th ledge and 34 feet above the gorge floor, when one of the crosspieces suddenly snapped under his weight. The dry crack of breaking wood echoed through the gorge like a gunshot. Derek's right foot plunged through where the crosspiece had been, throwing him off balance. He swung out over empty space, held only by his grip on a single branch with his left hand, his body dangling over the rocks far below. His broken legs smashed into the rock face, sending fresh waves of agony through his nervous system. For a long moment, Derek hung there in space, legs dangling, staring at the rocks far below that would certainly kill him if he fell. His left hand was slipping, his fingers losing their grip on the branch, and he could feel himself beginning to fall. Then, from somewhere deep inside, from some reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed, Derek roared. It was a primal sound, the cry of an animal fighting for its life, and with that roar came movement. He swung his right arm up, caught another branch with his right hand, pulled himself back against the ladder structure, found a foothold with his good leg, and continued climbing. 5th ledge achieved through sheer determination and refusal to die. 2 sections remained between Derek and freedom, between life and death. He was 45 feet up now, with only about 15 feet to go, but those 15 feet looked impossibly far. His body was shutting down in earnest now, systems failing, consciousness fading in and out. Every muscle screamed at him to stop, to rest, to give up. His broken leg was a dead weight, useless, just dragging him toward the abyss. With shaking hands that barely responded to his mental commands, Derek positioned the 6th section, tested it as best he could with his remaining strength, and began to climb. Each handhold was a victory over his failing body. Each pull upward required everything he had left, and then somehow finding more. The 6th ledge was narrower than the others, barely worthy of being called a ledge at all, really just a crack in the rock face that was perhaps 4 inches deep. Derek wedged himself into it, his body pressed against the cold stone, gasping for air, trying desperately to gather strength for what he knew had to be the final push. The top of the gorge was just above him now, tantalizingly close, maybe 8 or 9 feet away. But Derek stared at the gap with growing horror as he realized he was out of ladder sections. He'd built 6, and they'd gotten him this far, within spitting distance of freedom, but not quite far enough. Through vision that was increasingly blurred and distorted by fever and exhaustion, Derek studied the final stretch of wall, looking for any possible route upward. There, about 5 feet above his current position, was a root system from what looked like a juniper tree growing near the rim of the gorge. The roots hung down the rock face like organic ropes, their tendrils extending down toward him, but remaining just out of reach. If he could reach them, if they were strong enough to hold his weight without pulling free from the rock, he could pull himself up the last few feet to the rim. But they were just beyond his grasp from his current position on the narrow crack that served as the 6th ledge. He would have to climb the wall itself, free climbing without any ladder or support structure, using only the tiny cracks and small protrusions in the rock face as handholds. With the last reserves of his strength, knowing that this was his final chance and that failure meant death, Derek began to free climb the final section of wall. His right hand found a tiny crack in the limestone, barely deep enough to get his fingertips into. His good leg pushed against a small outcrop of rock that protruded maybe half an inch from the wall. He pulled upward, gained 6 inches of elevation. His left hand found another crack, deeper this time, enough to get his fingers in up to the first knuckle. His leg found another small protrusion. Pull. Up another 6 inches. His broken leg hung useless behind him, occasionally bouncing against the rock with each movement, sending fresh waves of pain through his nervous system. But pain didn't matter anymore, not when freedom was literally within arm's reach. Derek's right hand reached upward one more time and closed around the first root from the juniper tree. He tested it carefully, pulling on it gently at first, then with more force. It held firm, the root strong and well anchored in the rock above. Derek transferred his weight onto that single root, grabbed a second root with his left hand, and began to pull himself up hand over hand. The roots creaked and shifted, decades-old dirt raining down on his upturned face, small rocks and debris cascading past him. But the roots didn't break. Hand over hand, pulling with arms that were beyond exhaustion, Derek climbed those final few feet until finally, impossibly, miraculously, his head emerged over the rim of the gorge. The Montana wilderness spread out before him in the late afternoon sun, an ocean of trees and mountains extending to the horizon in every direction. Derek pulled himself onto solid ground, onto level earth, and collapsed, his chest heaving, his vision swimming, struggling to understand that he'd actually done it. For a long time, he simply lay there on his stomach at the edge of the gorge, feeling the solid earth beneath him, pine needles pressing into his face, understanding at some deep level that he'd accomplished something extraordinary. 17 days trapped in that stone prison, and he'd built a ladder from nothing but branches and willpower and cordage stripped from his own clothes and boots, and he'd climbed back into the world of the living. After maybe 20 minutes of lying there, Derek forced himself to roll over and sit up. From his new vantage point, he could see his truck parked in a small clearing maybe 2 miles away, across relatively flat terrain, dotted with pine trees and sagebrush. 2 miles. Under normal circumstances, Derek could have walked that distance in 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes if he was being careful. But these weren't normal circumstances. His body was utterly destroyed, pushed beyond any reasonable limit. 2 miles might as well have been 200 miles, but Derek had escaped the gorge, had climbed out of what should have been his tomb, and that meant he could reach his truck. That meant he could survive. Giving up now, after everything he'd endured, was simply not an option. Derek began crawling toward his truck, unable to stand or even walk on his knees because of his shattered leg. He pulled himself forward using his arms, dragging his body across the forest floor, moving perhaps 20 or 30 feet before having to stop and rest. Pine needles and small rocks dug into his stomach and chest. His clothes, already in tatters, tore further on the rough ground. Every few hundred feet, his body would simply shut down, refusing to move any further, and Derek would have to lie there for 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes losing consciousness entirely before he could continue. The sun was setting now, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple and red, and Derek knew he had to reach his truck before full darkness fell. Navigating through the forest at night in his condition would be impossible. He picked out landmarks, a distinctive lightning-struck pine tree, a large boulder, a small creek, and focused on reaching each one in turn, breaking the impossible journey into manageable segments. Reach the pine tree, rest, reach the boulder, rest, cross the creek, rest. It took Derek 5 hours to cover those 2 miles, 5 hours of crawling and resting and occasionally passing out from pain and exhaustion. The moon had risen by the time he finally reached his truck, full and bright, illuminating the clearing with silvery light. The truck looked exactly as he'd left it 17 days ago, covered in a light layer of dust and pine needles, completely undisturbed. Derek's spare keys were in a magnetic box hidden under the rear wheel well on the driver's side, right where he'd always kept them for emergencies exactly like this. His father had taught him that trick, had drilled into him the importance of always having a backup plan. With the last of his strength, Derek pulled himself up using the truck's running board and door handle, managed to open the driver's side door, and collapsed into the cab. The seat felt impossibly comfortable after 17 days on stone and dirt. For a moment, Derek just sat there, savoring the small victory, the simple act of sitting in his truck. Then he reached down, fumbled the spare key out of the magnetic box with fingers that barely worked, and started the engine. The truck roared to life immediately, the sound of the engine the most beautiful thing Derek had ever heard. He put the truck in gear and began the slow drive down the mountain, following the rough Forest Service road that would eventually connect to Highway 93. Derek drove slowly, carefully, knowing that his reaction time was severely compromised, that passing out while driving could be fatal. He kept the window down despite the cold, letting the night air blow across his face to help keep him conscious. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow road ahead, and Derek focused on following the tire tracks that marked the route. He made it 20 miles down the mountain, onto the paved highway, before his body finally gave up. Derek felt consciousness slipping away, felt the darkness closing in, and managed to guide the truck onto the shoulder of the road before everything went black. The truck rolled to a gentle stop on the gravel shoulder, engine still running, headlights still on, with Derek slumped over the steering wheel, his pulse so weak it was barely detectable. A passing motorist found him there about 45 minutes later. The driver, a local rancher named Tom Brennan, who was heading home after visiting friends in Missoula, saw the truck on the shoulder with its lights on and stopped to investigate, thinking someone might need help with a breakdown. When Tom looked into the cab and saw Derek's condition, emaciated, filthy, clearly injured, barely breathing, he immediately called 911 and then stayed with Derek until help arrived, talking to him, keeping pressure on him to stay conscious, not understanding yet the full scope of what this man had endured. The EMTs arrived within 20 minutes, their ambulance screaming down Highway 93 with lights flashing. When they first examined Derek, checking his vital signs, they thought he might already be dead. His pulse was thready and irregular, his blood pressure dangerously low, his breathing shallow and labored. His left leg was grotesquely swollen, discolored with shades of black and purple and green, and the smell of infection was overwhelming. The lead EMT, a veteran named Jennifer Ross, who'd been doing this job for 15 years, later said that in all her experience, she'd never seen someone in such critical condition who was still alive. They started 2 IVs immediately, pumping fluids and antibiotics into Derek's failing body, wrapped him in warming blankets to combat the hypothermia, splinted his leg properly, and radioed ahead to St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula to prepare for an incoming trauma case. During the 40-minute ambulance ride to the hospital, Derek drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling about ladders and climbing, sometimes calling out for Rachel, sometimes completely unresponsive. The EMTs worked frantically to stabilize him. Knowing they were in a race against time, Rachel was already at the hospital when the ambulance arrived, having been notified by search and rescue that Derek's truck had been found and that he was en route to St. Patrick. She'd spent the past 13 days in absolute agony, organizing search efforts, posting flyers, calling everyone she knew, refusing to believe that her husband was dead even when the searchers started talking about recovery rather than rescue. When she saw Derek being wheeled into the emergency room on a gurney, barely recognizable under the dirt and the injuries and the weight loss, she broke down completely, sobbing with relief and terror in equal measure. The emergency room doctors took one look at Derek and immediately called for an infectious disease specialist and an orthopedic surgeon. The infection in his leg was so severe, so advanced, that the initial recommendation was immediate amputation to save his life. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chen, examined the leg carefully and then pulled Rachel aside to explain the situation. The infection had spread into the bone itself, a condition called osteomyelitis, and there was significant tissue death throughout the lower leg. Standard protocol in cases this severe was amputation, cutting away all the infected tissue to prevent the infection from spreading further and killing the patient. But Rachel, knowing how much Derek loved the mountains, how much his ability to walk and hunt meant to his identity, begged them to try to save the leg. Dr. Chen was hesitant, explaining that attempting to save the leg significantly increased the risk of sepsis and death. But Rachel insisted. She knew Derek would rather die trying to keep his leg than live without it. After consulting with her team and considering the options carefully, Dr. Chen agreed to attempt a limb salvage procedure, but only if Derek's condition stabilized enough to survive the lengthy surgery required. Derek spent the next 6 weeks in the hospital, fighting multiple battles simultaneously. The first 3 days were the most critical as the medical team worked to bring the infection under control with massive doses of intravenous antibiotics and repeated surgical debridements to remove dead tissue. Derek developed sepsis anyway, his body mounting a systemic inflammatory response that caused his organs to begin shutting down. He spent 5 days in the ICU on a ventilator, his survival uncertain from hour to hour. But Derek, who'd survived 17 days in a gorge and built a ladder from branches to escape, wasn't ready to die in a hospital bed. Slowly, incrementally, his condition began to improve. The infection started responding to the antibiotics. His organs began functioning normally again. After 2 weeks, he was stable enough for Dr. Chen to perform the first of 3 major surgeries on his leg, installing metal plates and screws to reconstruct the shattered bones, carefully removing infected tissue while trying to preserve as much healthy tissue as possible. The recovery was long and brutal. Derek lost 40 pounds during his ordeal, dropping from a healthy 190 pounds to a skeletal 150. His muscles had atrophied from weeks of immobility and malnutrition. He had to relearn basic movements, had to work with physical therapists every day to regain strength and mobility. The pain was constant, requiring heavy pain medication that made him foggy and disconnected. There were days when Derek wondered if he'd made the right choice, if amputation might have been easier, but Rachel was there every day, encouraging him, reminding him why he'd fought so hard to survive. After 8 months of intensive physical therapy, working with therapists 3 times a week and doing exercises at home every day, Derek was walking again. Not perfectly. He would always have a pronounced limp, and his ankle never regained full range of motion. But he was walking on his own 2 legs, without crutches or a cane. It was a minor miracle, the therapist said, a testament to his determination and the skill of the surgical team. Most patients with injuries as severe as Derek's never walked normally again, if they walked at all. The psychological recovery took even longer than the physical recovery. Derek developed PTSD from his ordeal, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that made sleep difficult. The sound of wind through trees, which he'd always loved, now triggered anxiety attacks. He worked with a therapist specializing in trauma, slowly processing what had happened to him, learning to separate the past from the present. The therapy helped, but the experience had changed him fundamentally, had shown him how thin the line between life and death really was. The following summer, 14 months after his rescue, Derek led a small film crew back to the gorge where he'd been trapped. Getting permits to film had taken months of paperwork and negotiations with the Forest Service, but Derek felt it was important to document what had happened, to show others what he'd built and what the human spirit was capable of when survival was the only option. They hiked in carefully, Derek moving slowly on his reconstructed leg, and stood at the rim of the gorge looking down. The ladder was still there, weathered by winter storms, but essentially intact, a skeletal structure of branches and roots, rising up the eastern wall like the spine of some ancient creature. The film crew descended into the gorge using modern climbing equipment and filmed the ladder from multiple angles, showing the crude but effective construction, the way each section bridged the gaps between ledges. The lead cameraman, an experienced climber himself, examined the structure and shook his head in amazement. "I wouldn't have attempted this with climbing gear and 2 good legs," he said. "The fact that you built this and climbed it with a broken ankle is insane." Derek stood at the rim, looking down at the place where he'd spent 17 days building his escape, and felt something close to pride mixed with profound humility. "I didn't have a choice," he said simply. "It was build the ladder or die there. When those are your only options, you find a way." The documentary that resulted from that filming expedition aired on a major outdoor channel and went viral online, accumulating millions of views. Derek's story spread through the hunting community, through survival forums, through social media, inspiring people facing their own impossible challenges. People started coming to Derek for advice, for training, for the knowledge and mindset that had kept him alive in that gorge. He began teaching wilderness survival courses, sharing what he'd learned not just from books and training, but from lived experience. He taught people how to assess their resources in emergency situations, how to maintain hope when circumstances seemed hopeless, how to break impossible tasks into manageable steps. His classes filled up months in advance, drawing students from across the country who wanted to learn from someone who'd actually survived the kind of situation that killed most people. Derek never hunted alone after that experience, never again ventured into the wilderness without a partner and multiple forms of communication. The mountains were still in his blood, still called to him with the same primal pull they always had, but now he approached them with respect bordering on reverence, understanding their power to kill as well as their beauty. He carried 2 satellite phones, a personal locator beacon, extra food and redundant supplies. Some lessons, he told Rachel, are bought at too high a price to ever forget. The ladder stayed in the gorge for 3 more years, slowly weathering, slowly decomposing, becoming part of the landscape. Derek returned once a year to check on it, to pay his respects to the place that had tested him so thoroughly and the structure that had saved his life. On his 3rd annual visit, he found that winter storms had finally destroyed most of the ladder, toppling the upper sections and scattering branches across the gorge floor. The wood was returning to the earth, completing the natural cycle. Derek stood there for a long time, looking at the remains, and realized he was okay with it. The physical ladder was gone, but what it represented, human ingenuity, determination, the refusal to surrender to fate, that would never decay. By then, Derek's story had become something larger than just his personal experience. It had become a symbol used in motivational speeches, in therapy sessions, in survival training courses around the world. People who faced cancer, who dealt with addiction, who struggled with depression, who confronted their own impossible challenges, often referenced Derek's ladder as inspiration. If a man with a broken leg could build a ladder from branches and climb out of a 60-foot gorge, then surely they could face whatever obstacles life had placed in their path. Derek was always uncomfortable with being called a hero or an inspiration. "I'm just a guy who refused to die," he would say when people praised him. Anyone in the same situation would have done the same thing. But Rachel, who'd lived through those 13 days of not knowing if her husband was alive or dead, who'd watched him fight through the recovery, knew better. Not everyone would have done what Derek did. Most people would have given up, would have let despair win, would have died in that gorge. Derek's survival wasn't just about physical skills or luck. It was about the fundamental character trait of refusing to quit, of maintaining hope, even when hope seemed foolish. 10 years after his ordeal, Derek still walked with a limp, still had chronic pain in his reconstructed ankle, still occasionally woke from nightmares of falling and being trapped. But he also had a life he'd built with intention and gratitude, appreciating every day in a way that most people never do. He'd sold his hardware store and now worked full-time teaching survival skills and outdoor safety. His daughter Megan had followed him into outdoor education, becoming a park ranger in Glacier National Park. Rachel had written a book about their experience, about waiting and hoping and never giving up on the people you love. And sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Derek would sit on his back porch and look up at the mountains silhouetted against the stars, and he would think about that gorge and that ladder and those 17 days that had defined the rest of his life. He would think about the moment when he'd been hanging by one hand after the crosspiece broke, staring down at certain death, and he'd found the strength to roar and pull himself back up. That moment, more than any other, had taught him the fundamental truth that would guide him through every challenge that followed. Survival isn't about strength or skill or equipment, though those things help. Survival is about the moment when everything seems lost, when death seems inevitable, when every rational thought says to give up and you decide to live anyway. Everything else, the planning, the building, the climbing, the healing, all of that flows from that single decision to refuse defeat. That, Derek had learned in the bottom of a gorge 60 feet deep, was the real ladder that carried people through impossible situations. Not wood and rope and clever engineering, but the unbreakable human determination to see tomorrow, no matter the cost.